Okay, just to remind you, there will be a movie showing tonight, a Jim Jarmusch movie, I think at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. Welcome to Weekly Marks, the 2nd of August, 2025. What we're going to look at is the introduction to Karl Marx Volume 3 and the economic manuscripts of the 1864 to 65, the Ben Folks translation with Fred. The introduction is written by Fred Moseley. It's 2016. The point of doing this, of course, is the English-speaking Marxist scholars can finally compare Engels' is Volume 3. That's this sort of conventional 1894 Capital Volume 3 with Marx's original manuscript and evaluate for, well, Marxist scholars can evaluate for themselves the significance of the difference. Okay, so Fred Moseley's introduction. Marx's only full draft of Volume 3 of Capital was written in the economic manuscript of 1864 to 65. Marx's Book 3 manuscript was heavily edited by Engels for the first German edition of Volume 3 in 1894 after working on the project on and off for 11 years. A long-standing question in Marxian scholarship is concerned just how much Engels changed Marx's manuscript and whether there are significant differences between the two. Marx's original manuscript was published for the first time in German in 1992 in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, the MEGA, the MEGA, Section 2, Volume 4.2. But this important manuscript had not been translated into English until this volume. Therefore, the publication of an English translation of Marx's original manuscript is an important event in Marxian scholarship. English-speaking Marxist scholars can finally compare Engels' Volume 3 of 1894 with Marx's original manuscript of 1864 to 5 and evaluate for themselves the significance of the differences. This is Fred Moseley. I am very grateful to Ben Folks, the eminent translator of Marx's works, for taking on this important task. This publication of Marx's original Book 3 manuscript, Volume 3 manuscript, is part of the monumental MEGA project, MEGA, the comprehensive 110-volume collected works of Marx and Engels in German, publication still ongoing. Especially important is Section 2, which includes all the economic manuscripts related to capital, the Grundrisse, volumes 1.1 to 1.2, the economic manuscript of 1858 to 61, Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy and the Ur text, volume 2, the economic manuscript of 1861 to 63, volumes 3.1 to 3.6, the economic manuscript of 1863 to 67, volumes 4.1 to 4.3. See, there is a volume 4. And the manuscripts after 1867, including all the published editions of volume 1, the little-known manuscripts written in the 1870s, and Engels edited volumes 1 and 2, volumes 5 through 15. All of Marx's manuscripts in Section 2 have now been published in German. The editors of the MEGA, the MEGA, are to be thanked profusely for so expertly carrying out this extremely important task. This introduction will highlight the main differences between Marx's original manuscript and Engels' edited Volume 3 in the view of this editor. It is hoped that other Marxian scholars will explore further this important question. The translator Ben Folks has very helpfully distinguished in the text between parts of Marx's manuscript that are included in Engels' Volume 3, marked off by caret left and caret right with a bracket. No, caret left and caret right. And parts of Marx's manuscript not included by default marked off by caret right and caret left. See translator's note number 2. Folks has also prepared a useful appendix that lists all the pages in Marx's text that were not included in Engels' Volume 3. In comparing Marx's manuscript and Engels' volume, the first point to clarify is that Engels converted Marx's chapter into parts, quote unquote, and converted Marx's sections of chapters into chapters and created some chapters and sections of his own. In the discussion that follows, I will try to make it clear whose chapters I'm talking about. This introduction will discuss each of Marx's 7 chapters, that is, Engels' parts, in turn. I, that is Fred, would like to emphasize to begin with what a daunting task Engels faced in editing Marx's manuscript. In the first place, the manuscript was very uneven, with some chapters in close to finished forms, that is, chapters 2, 4, and 7, while other chapters, most notably chapter 5 and also chapter 1, were very rough, in some parts little more than a collection of notes and quotes. But more importantly, when Engels started this very difficult project, he appears to have had very little knowledge and overall understanding of Marx's Book 3. Engels' scant knowledge of Book 3 is evidenced by a series of letters between Marx and Engels in April 1868. Engels asked Marx how he explained merchant profit and how the general rate of profit is determined with merchant capital. Now, in order to answer this question, Marx replied with a long and detailed summary of Book 3. Unfortunately, Engels' question and Marx's long answer indicate how little Engels understood about Book 3 at the time. Marx appears to be explaining all this to Engels for the first time. Marx starts out, quote, "It is proper that you should know the method by which the rate of profit is developed. In Book 3, we then come to the conversion of surplus value into its different forms and separate component parts," close quote. This letter gives a very clear explanation of chapters 1, 2, and 4 of Marx's Book 3. Enough to answer Engels' question about merchant profit, and also enough to give Engels a basic understanding of these parts for the purpose of editing them. The summary of chapter 3 on the falling rate of profit is only 3 sentences. After chapter 4 on merchant profit, the summaries of the remaining parts are only a few sentences, perhaps because these chapters were not necessary to answer Engels' question about merchant profit, and or perhaps because Marx was running out of steam in writing this long, substantial letter. Chapter 5 on interest, which later gave Engels the most trouble, is only a few lines and a bare outline. But this letter appears to be all Engels had to go on in understanding and editing Volume 3. There is no evidence that Fred knows of any further discussions between Marx and Engels in the last 15 years of Marx's life about the contents of his Book 3, and certainly no instructions to guide Engels in his editing. Marx probably avoided discussing his work on Books 2 and 3 with Engels because Engels would have pressured him to finish the books. Indeed, Marx apparently did not even tell Engels directly and in person to edit these remaining books, but instead told his daughter Eleanor to tell Engels. In light of Engels' limited knowledge of Book 3 before embarking on this enormous editing task and Marx's scant to non-existent instructions about what needed to be done, I think it is quite a remarkable achievement that Engels was able to do as good a job as he did, which does not mean that there are no problems. The main difference between Marx's manuscript and Engels' Volume 3 is that Engels' editing made Marx's manuscript appear to be much better organized and more complete and finished than it actually was, especially Chapter 5 and also Chapter 1. However, Engels' improved organization did not change the overall logical structure of Marx's manuscript. The order of the chapters and parts is exactly the same, and does not necessarily change Marx's emphasis on the meaning of specific passages. We will investigate below the extent to which Engels' editing did change Marx's meaning or emphasis. The first important misleading change that Engels made was the title of the book. Marx's title of the manuscript of 1864 to 65 was Die, Die Gestaltungen des Gesamtprozesses, that is, the forms of the processes as a whole. We know from the contents of the book that the forms, quote unquote, presented in this book are particular forms of appearance of capital and surplus value, that is, profit, average profit, commercial capital, and commercial profit, interest-bearing capital and interest, and landed capital and rent. In my view, a better title for Volume 3 would be The Forms of Appearance of Capital and Surplus Value. That is what Volume 3 is primarily about. Unfortunately, Engels deleted Gestaltungen from the title and changed the title to Gesamtprozess der kapitalistischen Produktion, the process of capitalist production as a whole. Now, this title misses the main point of Marx's manuscript, which Engels maybe did not fully understand, as discussed above. Book 3 is indeed about capitalist production as a whole in the sense of the unity of the process of production, that is Book 1, and the process of circulation, Book 2. But more precisely, Book 3 is about the particular forms of appearance of capital and surplus value, that is, profit, average profit, etc., that develop out of the processes as a whole already theorized. Volgrath and Jungnickel argue that pressure from the publisher forced Engels to change the title. It had been so long since the publications of Volume 1 and 2 that a new title was needed that would make a clearer connection to the first two volumes. They also argue that neither Marx's title nor Engels fit the contents of the book, and they suggest a slight variation of Engels' title, The Process of Capitalist Reproduction as a Whole. However, Fred argues that this title does not fit the contents of the book any better than Engels' title. Gestaltungen is missing again, and Gestaltungen is the key word of the title because the contents of the book are the forms of capital and surplus value. Now, Gestaltungen is a new and unusual term in Marx's manuscripts. To my knowledge, it was not used in Marx's earlier manuscripts and is used only 7 times in this manuscript, besides the title. And its full meaning is not entirely clear. The usual translation of Gestaltungen is forms, i.e., as a synonym for the German word form. But then why didn't Marx simply use the word form? What additional connotation of Gestaltungen did Marx have in mind with this unusual choice of words in his title? An indication of Marx's full meaning of Gestaltungen is given in the first paragraph of this manuscript. Quote, "What is necessary is rather to discover and present the concrete forms, Formen, which grow out of the process of capital, considered as a whole. The forms, Gestaltungen of capital, as we develop them in this book, thus come closer, step by step, to the form in which they appear at the surface of society, in the everyday consciousness of the agents of production themselves, and finally, in the action of the different capitals upon each other, namely competition," close quote. Thus, we can see that the aim of this book is to present the concrete forms, or the particular forms, that grow out of the capitalist process as a whole, as they appear on the surface of capitalist society and in the everyday consciousness of capitalists and economists. Therefore, Gestaltungen seems to mean more specifically the concrete, particular surface forms of appearance of capital and surplus value. Inwood's Hegel Dictionary defines Gestalt as follows, quote, "Objects that have a Gestalt are thought of as organic unities, appreciable only as a whole, not by the piecemeal consideration of their parts," close quote. Now, this connotation certainly fits with Marx's theory of the particular forms of surplus value in the manuscript of 1864 to 65. All the particular forms of surplus value are explained on the basis of a unifying principle. They all come from the same source, that is, the surplus labor of workers, and thus they are all apprehensible only as an organic unity and cannot be understood by the piecemeal consideration of their parts. Now, one more point of general introduction. Mueller et al. Argue that Marx began writing this manuscript with chapter 2 and then wrote chapters 1 and 3 in that order. After chapter 3, Marx switched to book 2 and wrote a complete draft of book 2, published in Amiga section 2, volume 4.11 in 2008, after which he returned to book 3 and wrote the remaining chapters in order. Now, their argument about the backward order of the compositions of chapters 1 and 2 is based primarily on the pagination of the two chapters. Marx originally gave letters rather than numbers to pages in chapter 2, and then later numbered chapters 1 and 2 consecutively. However, Fred discusses below other reasons that have to do with the content of chapter 2 that suggested to him that chapter 2 was written after chapter 1. I don't think it really matters which chapter was written first, but it's interesting to speculate, and it might turn out to be important. Now, to discuss in turn each of 7 chapters in Marx's manuscript, starting with chapter 1. Chapter 1, the transformation of surplus value into profit. Engels Part 1 is one of the chapters with the biggest differences between Marx's manuscript and Engels Volume 3. Engels said in his preface, now for Part 1, the main manuscript, quote, for Part 1, the main manuscript could be used only with major limitations. The mathematical treatment of the relationship between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit corresponding to our Chapter 3 was introduced in full right at the beginning, while the subject of our Chapter 1 appeared only later and in passing. 2 attempted revisions came to the rescue here, each with folio sheets, though even these did not entirely fill the gap. The present Chapter 1 was put together from these drafts, close quote. Marx's 2 attempted revisions that Engels mentions and that he used as the primary basis of his Chapter 1 were written in 1867 to 1868 and were recently published for the first time, 2012, in German in the Amiga Section 2, Volume 4.3. Now, this volume has not yet been translated into English. A translation of this volume into English should be a top priority for Marxian scholarship. Let me put the footnote in. This volume also contains sections on other interesting and important topics, including the effect of turnover on the rate of profit, perhaps written to fill in the missing section on this subject in Chapter 1 of the Economic Manuscript of 1864 to 65, and also an intriguing and heretofore unknown 30-page section on the determination of prices of production, including with unequal turnover times and unequal rates of surplus value across industries. And this is the only time that Marx discussed these important topics. That's note 22. Now, back to page 8. After the first paragraph of Marx's Chapter 1, which is similar to the first paragraph of Engels' Chapter 1, there are 4 important paragraphs in Marx's chapter that are missing in Engels' chapter. In these paragraphs, Marx argues that the theory of surplus value presented in the previous 2 books has determined the magnitude of surplus value produced by a given capital in a year. Now, if this predetermined magnitude of surplus value is related to the total capital advanced instead of variable capital alone, which is the true source of surplus value, right, labor, then this magnitude of surplus value is transformed into profit. The magnitude of profit is the same as the magnitude of surplus value. The difference is that this predetermined magnitude is viewed subjectively from a different perspective. That is the capitalist perspective. So let me break here for a second and note that this is could be a standpoint issue. Here are excerpts from these missing paragraphs. Quote, In one year, a capital produces a certain quantity of surplus value. If one now calculates the surplus value produced in a year in relation to the total capital advance, which consists of the constant capital advance plus the variable capital advance, the surplus value is transformed into profit. From the point of quote, from the point of view of its material, the profit is nothing other than the surplus value itself. Its absolute magnitude does not therefore differ from the absolute magnitude of the surplus value which capital produces during a given turnover time. It is surplus value itself, but calculated differently, or as it initially appears, viewed subjectively in a different way. Profit, in a material sense, and therefore as an absolute magnitude or quantity, is not at all different from surplus value, e.g., 100 pounds, close quote. The earlier drafts of this chapter in the Grundrisse and the manuscript of 61 to 63, 1861 to 1863, started off with similar paragraphs. Now, on the basis of this assumption that the magnitude of profit is equal to the predetermined magnitude of surplus value, Marx derives in this chapter some laws, quote unquote, which have to do with the relation between the rate of surplus value, that is S over V, and the rate of profit, S over C plus V. These laws are discussed in terms of a single capital, and they also apply to the total social capital. The single capital represents the total social capital. In Marx's 1868 letter, he made this point explicitly, quote, "These laws, moreover, remain directly applicable if S over C plus V is treated as the relation of the socially produced surplus value to the social capital." Marx made a similar statement in the first draft of this chapter in the manuscript of 1861 to 63. Quote, "Now, just as the surplus value of the individual capital in each sphere of production is the measure of the absolute magnitude of the profit, merely a converted form of surplus value, so is the total surplus value produced by the total capital the absolute measure of the total profit of the total capital, whereby profit should be understood to include all forms of surplus value, such as rent, interest, etc. It is therefore the absolute magnitude of value which the capitalist class can divide among its members under various headings," close quote. Thus, we can see that at the beginning of Book 3, the total amount of surplus value produced in the economy as a whole in a year is taken as a predetermined given. Now, after these opening paragraphs, Marx launched into a very long footnote, 34 printed pages, that is, pages 53 to 81 of this volume, which the MEGA editors brought into the text, and which is a detailed analysis with many tedious numerical examples of the difference, lowercase d, between the rate of surplus value, S, lowercase s prime, and the rate of profit, bracket, lowercase p prime, close bracket, bracket d equals s prime minus p prime, close bracket, and the effects on this difference of changes in constant capital and or variable capital. Now, but Marx realized in the process of this analysis that it is better to analyze the relation between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit directly rather than in terms of the difference between them. And that is what he did later in this chapter, as we will see below. Engels rightfully did not include any of this long dead-end footnote in his chapter 3. Now, the next section of Marx's manuscript, this volume, pages 84 to 92, was given the title Cost Price by the MEGA editors and contains subject matter related to Engels' chapter 1, that is, cost, price, and profit, and also Engels' chapter 2, the rate of profit. Now, after this section, there's another long, detailed analysis of the relation between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, which the MEGA editors gave the title, quote, the relationship between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, close quote, borrowed from Engels. But this time, the analysis is in terms of the following equations, which is a much better framework. The lowercase p prime equals lowercase s prime bracket v slash big C close bracket, where v is variable capital, that is lowercase v is variable capital, and big C is the total capital. Big bracket C, big C equals lowercase c plus v semicolon, where C is constant capital, closed bracket. Now, another bracket. This equation is included in Engels' chapter 3, but it's less prominent. Marx's main and obvious point is that the rate of profit depends not only on the rate of surplus value, but also on the relative proportions of variable capital and constant capital in the total capital. This point was intended as a critique of Ricardo and classical economists in general, who tended to ignore constant capital in the composition of capital and identify the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, or the profit to wage ratio. Marx stated during this analysis, quote, as can be studied with the Ricardians, etc., it's completely wrong-headed to seek directly to present the laws of the rate of profit as laws of the rate of surplus value, or vice versa. One can therefore see that the movement of the rate of profit can be very complicated, and that its analysis is by no means as simple a matter as the political economists have so far imagined, close quote. With the help of Samuel Moore, Engels condensed Marx's 44 printed pages of detailed numerical examples into 20 pages in his chapter 3, which he gave the title, quote, the relationship between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, close quote. Now, this equation above seems to imply that the rate of profit will always vary directly with the variable capital, which, which seems logical, right? However, Marx realized in the course of this exploratory analysis that this law is valid only if the wage rate per worker is assumed to remain constant, so that variable capital serves as what Marx called an index of the number of workers employed, which changes only if the number of workers changes. Now, with this assumption, a change of variable capital will leave the rate of surplus value unaffected and will change the rate of profit in the same direction. However, if variable capital changed as a result of a change in the wage rate per worker, then, assuming a constant working day, the rate of surplus value would also change and would vary inversely with variable capital, and thus the rate of profit might also vary inversely to variable capital. And this law would no longer be valid. Therefore, in Marx's further analysis of this quote-unquote law, he generally assumed that the wage rate remains constant, and thus lowercase v serves as an index of the number of workers employed. On the other hand, Marx emphasized in these pages that constant capital is different in this respect. That is, with respect to effects on the rate of profit, the crucial point here is irrelevant whether a change in constant capital is due to a change in the quantity of means of production or to a change in the prices of the means of production analogous to the wage rate. In both cases, the change of constant capital does not affect the rate of surplus value, and thus the rate of profit will always vary inversely to a change of constant capital. Now, Marx expressed this key difference between the effect of changes of variable capital and constant capital on the rate of profit in the following important passages in this section of chapter 1. In this section of chapter 1, quote, this shows precisely the special organic relationship that the variable capital has with the movement of the capital as a whole and its valorization, as well as its distinction from the constant capital. The latter, to the extent that the creation of value comes into consideration, is important only on account of the value that it has. It is quite immaterial here, as far as value formation is concerned, whether a constant capital of 1,500 pounds represents 1,500 tons of iron at £1 per ton or 500 tons at £3. The quantity of actual material is completely unimportant for the formation of value and its influence on the rate of profit. The rate of profit is inversely related to it. Whatever relationship the increase or decrease in the exchange value of the constant capital has to do with the material elements, the use values which it represents. Close quote. Well, continuing, quote, the situation is completely different in the case of lowercase v. What is important is not the value which it has, the labor which is objectified in it, but that this value is an index of the total labor that it sets in motion and which is not expressed in it. Close quote. And in the concluding paragraphs of chapter 1, Marx stated again, quote, if we consider the influence of lowercase c on the rate of profit, the reasons why c falls are entirely irrelevant, although differences between the causes for a fall have a very evident impact on the prices of commodities. What is of decisive importance, however, is whether lowercase v changes because a smaller or larger number of workers is technologically required for the production of the same value. Whether, therefore, the decrease or increase in lowercase v is an index of the amount of labor set in motion, or lowercase v or rises or falls because of the wage rises and falls, close quote. Engels included the first chapter above in his chapter 3, page 144, but did not include the second concluding paragraph, and this omission weakens this important point. After the second paragraph just quoted, Marx stated in a brief preview of his chapter 2, which unfortunately Engels did not include, that what has been analyzed in chapter 1 as changes over time in a given capital will be analyzed in chapter 2 as differences between capitals, different proportions of constant capital and variable capital in different industries at the same time. Quote, it should finally be remarked that what we have presented here as movements of different constituents of the same capital over a period of time could just as well be presented as differences between different capitals in various areas of investment lying alongside each other in a spatial sense, and that what has been presented so far will be utilized in this latter form in the next chapter. Close quote. The important point about the different effects on the rate of profit of changes in variable capital and constant capital is also applied in chapter 2 to the different effects on the rate of profit of different proportions of constant capital and variable capital across industries. After this long section, the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, the rest of Marx's chapter 1 is very similar to chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Engels' part 1. Marx's section 3, economy in the use of constant capital, becomes Engels' chapter 5. Marx's section 4, the effect of changes in raw material prices, and section 5, release and tying up of capital depreciation and appreciation, reevaluation and devaluation of capital, become Engels' chapter 6. And Marx's section 7, profit as it appears to the bourgeois, becomes Engels' chapter 7. Now with a less informative title, that is Supplementary Remarks. Engels' chapters are somewhat condensed with fewer and shorter examples and some material rearranged, but I do not find any significant differences in the content and meaning. Marx's section 6 was only a title, that is the influence of changes in circulation time, its shortening and lengthening. And Engels wrote his short chapter 4, the effect of the turnover on the rate of profit, on this subject, and moved its location up in front of the chapters mentioned in the last paragraph, perhaps because Marx's 1868 letter suggests this earlier location. The main point of this chapter is not controversial, that the annual rate of profit varies inversely with the turnover time of capital. For example, a reduction in turnover time would increase the annual rate of profit. When Engels wrote his chapter 4 in the 1880s, Marx had already discussed in volume 2 the effect of turnover time on the quantity of advanced capital and the effect of turnover time on the rate of profit follows from this earlier analysis. Engels discussed in his chapter examples of reduction in turnover time due to railroads, steamships, and the Suez Canal. All right, now chapter 2. In chapter 2, the transformation of profit into average profit is the pivotal chapter in Marx's book 3, in which he presented his theory of the general rate of profit and prices of production, i.e., the infamous transformation problem. This chapter is the beginning of Marx's theory of the distribution of surplus value, and it has to do specifically with the division of the total surplus value into average amounts for each industry, so that each industry receives the same general rate of profit on the capital invested in that industry. And this theory of the distribution of surplus value takes as a presupposition the total amount of surplus value produced in the economy as a whole in a year that is to be distributed across individual industries, which has been determined by the prior theory of the production of surplus value in volumes 1 and 2. The presupposed total annual surplus value, capital S, a large S, is used to determine the general rate of profit, large R equals large S slash large C. And the general rate of profit is then a prerequisite in the determination of prices of production. That is capital P sub I minus bracket P sub I minus bracket C I plus V I close bracket 1 plus R bracket. In Marx's main numerical example in this chapter, the total annual surplus value is 110 and the total capital advanced is 500, so that the general rate of profit, there's a lot of numbers in there, is 22%. Chapter 2, that is Engels part 2, is of course very controversial, and many, Moseley included, have wondered whether Marx's original chapter 2 was significantly different from Engels' part 2. But this turns out largely not to be the case. Chapter 2 in Marx's manuscript is much better organized and more finished than Chapter 1, and Engels' part 2 is almost the same as Marx's Chapter 2, with very little editing. Marx's Chapter 2 is divided into 5 sections with titles which Engels converted into his chapters 8 through 12. Geert Ruden has argued that Engels' editing of Chapter 2 polished away most of Marx's worries that Marx expressed in Section 3, which is equivalent to Engels' Chapter 10, about his theory of prices of production presented in Section 2, that is Engels' Chapter 9. But in comparing the two texts, I find, that is, Fred Moseley finds no evidence to support this conclusion, and Ruden provides no specific examples. Marx's Section 3 is almost identical to Engels' Chapter 10. I find no worries, that Fred finds no worries expressed in Marx's Section 3 that were polished out by Engels. In Folks's, that is Ben Folks's appendix to this volume, which lists all the passages in Marx's manuscript that were not included in Engels' Volume 3, there are no entries for Section 3 of Chapter 2, that is Engels' Chapter 10. However, there are a few significant passages that are in Marx's manuscript, but are missing in Engels' volume. The first important set of passages that are missing in Engels' Part 2, Chapter 8, are several intermittent paragraphs between pages 200 and 205 in this volume that have to do mainly with unequal turnover times of different capitals, which is another source of unequal rates of profit, besides unequal compositions of capital. Engels' omission of these paragraphs obscures this important further complication in Marx's theory of prices of production. The second important passage that is missing in Engels' Part 2 is 3 paragraphs that should be in Engels' Chapter 9. This omission was first pointed out by Alejandro Ramos the passage is missing from page 263 of Engels chapter 9. It should be in the middle of the page after the paragraph that begins, quote, in volumes 1 and 2, close quote, ... close quote. And it presents a concise algebraic formulation of the determination of the value and price of production of commodities and the conditions under which value is greater than, less than, or equal to price of production. An excerpt from the missing passage appears below, and this is fairly long, and I don't, you'll get lost here. Let me just not read the algebra, or I'll read the last line of algebra. Value equals cost price plus surplus value, or profit as identical with surplus value. Cost price equals value minus surplus value. Price of production equals cost price plus profit calculated according to the general rate of profit P prime, lowercase p prime. And then there's a little cogitation that goes on where large V equals large K plus S or P, and large P equals K plus P prime. Large V equals large P when S equals P prime, P greater than P when P prime is less than S, and less than P when P prime is greater than S. Oh. The important point here is that the cost price component, that is K, is the same in the determination of both value and price of production in all of these formulations. The only possible difference between value and price of production is the second component, that is, whether surplus value is greater than, less than, or equal to profit. This very clear passage provides important new evidence that the cost price is supposed to be the same in the determination of both values and prices of production in Marx's theory, as I and others have argued. This is actually a moderately important point, mainly because there's not enough attention paid to cost price. You'll see in some Marxist texts that they don't spend enough time explaining what cost price is, or rather slough it off in a also called cost price, whatever. Back to the text. In other words, there are not two cost prices in Marx's theory, one equal to values and the other equal to prices of production, but only one cost price, which is the actual cost price. That is the sum of the actual constant capital and variable capital advanced to purchase means of production and labor power consumed in production, which in turn is equal to the prices of production of the inputs. Thus, according to this interpretation, and contrary to the traditional interpretation, Marx did not fail to transform the inputs because the inputs, that is the cost prices, are not supposed to be transformed, as is commonly alleged, but are instead supposed to be the same magnitude, large K, in the determination of both values and prices of production. Another important passage that is missing in Engels Part 2 is at the very end of Marx's Chapter 2 as one of 4 supplementary remarks. Engels included Marx's other 3 supplementary remarks in his Chapter 12, but did not include a very important one, which is entitled, quote, Transition from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, close quote. Now, this supplement obviously belongs at the end of Chapter 1, but is written at the end of Chapter 2. Instead of relocating the supplement at the end of his Part 1, Engels chose not to include it, which I think was unfortunate. So, there's an entire paragraph about a typo, perhaps. One important difference between Marx's Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 is that Chapter 2, the relative proportion of variable capital and constant capital is discussed throughout in terms of the concept of the organic composition of capital. The 3 related definitions of the technical composition of capital, the value composition, and the organic composition are presented in the opening pages of Chapter 2, and these concepts are utilized throughout the chapter. However, in Chapter 1, these concepts are not used at all, even though the relative proportion of variable capital and constant capital also plays a crucial role in this chapter, as we've seen above. It appears that Marx gained greater clarity about these concepts while working on Chapter 2, and he wrote this summary of Chapter 1 and transition to Chapter 2 in terms of these concepts. So it is worth quoting this important supplement in full. Supplement to the transition from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2 of this book. Now, we've considered the subject under three aspects. Number one, a change in the mode of production, and as a result in the composition of capital. Number two, no change in the mode of production, a change in the value relation between constant and variable capital, involving no change in the relative amounts of these elements of capital, but a change in the value of the commodities which enter into the formation of the constant and variable capital. And number three, a change in the mode of production and in the value of the elements of constant and variable capital, or of one or other of them, etc. What was considered here as a variation within the organic composition of a single capital can equally appear, that is, make itself felt as a difference between the organic compositions of the capitals of different spheres of production. Firstly, instead of a variation in the organic composition of one and the same capital, a difference in the organic composition of different capitals. Secondly, an alteration in the organic composition of capital as a result of the change in value of the two parts of the same capital, a difference in the value of the machinery, raw materials, etc., applied on behalf of capitals in different trades. Now, this is not true for variable capital, since we assume an equal wage rate in the different trades. The difference in the value of different days of labor in different trades has nothing to do with the matter at hand. If the labor of a goldsmith is dearer than that of a laborer, the surplus time of the goldsmith is of greater value than that of the peasant in the same proportion. Close quote. It is clear that in this passage that the organic composition of capital across industries may be different for two reasons, both because of difference in the technical composition of capital and also because of differences in the values of the means of production. The reason that differences in the value of the means of production are included in Marx's definition of the organic composition of capital is that such differences have the same effect on the rate of profit as different technical compositions of capital as discussed above. But variable capital is different. Variable capital per worker, or wages per worker, is assumed to be equal across industries because, unlike constant capital, unequal wages across industries have a different effect on the rate of profit than unequal quantities of labor employed across industries, as Marx discussed at length in both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, and as we discussed above. Ben Fine and Alfredo Saad-Filho have offered a different interpretation of Marx's concept of the organic composition of capital, according to which the organic composition differs across industries for only one reason, because of unequal technical compositions of capital only, and not because of unequal values of the means of production. Their interpretation is contradicted by Marx's very clear summary of Chapter 1 discussed above, and also by the transition to Chapter 2 just discussed, and indeed by Marx's discussion throughout Chapter 2. Now, for example, another clear statement that the organic composition of capital in different industries may be different for these two reasons is that the first sentence of Section 2 of Chapter 2 in Marx's manuscript, which is the first sentence of Chapter 9 of Engel's Volume 3. Quote, at any one given time, the organic composition of capital depends on two factors. Firstly, on the technological proportion between the labor power and the means of production applied, and secondly, on the price of those means of production in the different spheres of production, close quote. Finally, this supplement to Chapter 2 is one of the main pieces of textual evidence that leads Fred to think that Marx wrote Chapter 1 before Chapter 2, contrary to Muller et al., as mentioned above. If Chapter 1 had not yet been written when Marx wrote this supplement at the end of Chapter 2, why wouldn't he write this supplement in Chapter 1 to be written next, where it belongs? It seems more plausible to me, to Fred, that Marx realized after first writing chapter 1 and then writing chapter 2 that this summary and transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2 was necessary. So he wrote this transition at the end of chapter 2, intending to relocate it later. Well, that may or may not be the case. Also, the same conclusion is suggested by the fact that the concept of the organic composition of capital, which Marx developed and used extensively in chapter 2, is not mentioned at all in chapter 1. If chapter 1 had been written after the supplemented chapter 2, it seems likely that Marx would have used the concept of the organic composition of capital explicitly in chapter 1, especially in the concluding paragraphs of chapter 1 discussed above, which are about the ratio of constant capital and variable capital without this ratio being called the organic composition of capital. The fact that he did not use this concept in chapter 1 suggests to me that he wrote chapter 1 before he developed the concept in chapter 2. Whew. A final piece of evidence for this interpretation is the beginning of chapter 2. In the first few pages, Marx wrote a detailed summary of the main points of chapter 1, including points that Marx had not hitherto discussed in his previous manuscripts. For example, assuming a constant rate of surplus value, the rate of profit will vary as a result of changes in constant capital or variable capital and the proportion between them, discussed extensively in chapter 1 as we saw above and not before. And also the tie-up and release of capital. Now, these details suggest to Fred that Marx had recently written chapter 1, and these details were fresh in his mind as he started chapter 2. There's a lot of cogitation there. And, you can raise certain questions about the sequence. But anyway, chapter 3. Chapter 3 is, of course, the chapter in which Marx presents his famous theory of the falling rate of profit. That is, the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit with the advance of capitalist production. And, like chapter 2, is also very controversial. Engels made the following changes to Marx's chapter 3, which are of varying degrees of significance. In the first place, Marx's chapter was not divided into any sections, and Engels divided his part 3 into 3 chapters, the well-known chapters 13, 14, and 15, with chapters 14 and 15 further divided into sections. The titles of the chapters and sections were also added by Engels. This structure, of course, makes Marx's manuscript look more organized and more complete than it actually was, but it does not necessarily change its meaning or emphasis. Secondly, Engels left out an important footnote from early in his chapter 15, which states clearly that the rate of profit, that is the ratio of the total surplus value or profit to the total capital advanced, is independent of the division of the total surplus value into industrial profit, interest, and rent. Okay, now this is, I will leave it to you to read because you will just get lost if I start reading it, but it is rate of profit equals surplus value over capital advanced. And, the reciprocal displacement of capital P prime, Z, and R amounts to no more than a change in the distribution of capital P, or big P, under its different headings. So Marx had already emphasized this point earlier in his chapter 3, and Engels included this passage in his chapter 13. So maybe Engels thought that this footnote was redundant. Now, another change made by Engels was to relocate 5 pages from the middle of his chapter 15, that is pages 350 to 355 in this volume, to the end of his chapter 13, that is pages 332 to 8 in Engels volume 3. And Engels also added 2 pages of his own in the middle of these pages, pages 334 to 5 to 35, which are marked as an addition. The relocation of these pages makes some sense, since these pages are primarily about an increase in the mass of profit in spite of a decrease in the rate of profit. And this subject is also discussed in the preceding pages in chapter 13. Again, this relocation is not necessarily inconsistent with Marx's intentions. Geert Rutten has argued that Engels' relocation gives more weight to chapter 13, which Engels entitled The Law as Such. and thus gives the impression that Marx concluded that the rate of profit would definitely decline over the long run as a secular trend instead of fluctuating between periods of decline and periods of increase without a definite trend over the long run. The latter is Rutan's interpretation, and this is actually an important point. I agree in part. That is, Fred agrees in part. Fred Moseley agrees in part, but Fred thinks that the additional weight given to Chapter 13 and to the law as such, interpretation by this relocation, is minor and hardly noticeable. And as mentioned, this relocation makes sense in that the topic of the relocated pages is the same as the end of Chapter 13, to which it is joined. Rutan has also pointed out that Engels inserted the following important sentence towards the end of the relocated text that he did not mark as an insertion. Quote, in practice, however, the rate of profit will fall in the long run, as we have already seen. Now, close quote. This sentence clearly gives the impression that Marx concluded that the rate of profit would definitely decline in the long run. But this is a misleading impression, as Rutan argues, because the sentence was written by Engels and not Marx. On the other hand, the end of Marx's title of Chapter 3, with the advance of capitalist production, which Engels deleted, seems to suggest a long-run secular decline. I don't know. That's just my little editorial remark there. Not necessarily. Volgraf and Jungnickel have noted another misleading modification that Engels made in his Chapter 15 in the last paragraph of Section 1. Marx stated in parentheses that the centralization and concentration of capital would cause a shake, that is, klappen, in capitalist production if there were not counteracting tendencies. Engels removed the parentheses and changed the mild word klappen to the stronger Zusammenbruch, collapse or breakdown. Volgraf and Jungnickel argued that this one change encouraged the breakdown theorists of the Second International, for example, Kautsky. Now, this is actually an important point, because this whole issue of whether there is or isn't crisis, and the question of the long and the short run and blah, 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 all that is, it is problematized, all right? So anyway, Heinrich has argued that the section of Marx's chapter that Engels turned into his Chapter 15, that is the chapter titled Development of the Law's Contradictions, is no longer systematic, but is only a large mass of remarks, additions, and argumentative approaches in unelaborated and incomplete form. This description is accurate for the last 10 pages of this section, which Engels turned into his Section 4 of Chapter 15, entitled Supplementary Remarks, since these pages are indeed a few remarks presented in non-systematic fashion. However, the first 3 sections of this chapter are systematic in the sense that they are all various aspects of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Section 1 makes 3 main points. The relative proportions of industrial profit, interest, and rent may have been different from the overall rate of profit. A decrease in the rate of profit may be accompanied by an increase in the mass of profit, and the decline in the rate of profit is not due to reduced exploitation, but to a decline in the number of workers employed. The main point of Section 2 is that the development of the productivity of labor in capitalism has 2 main effects: an increase of surplus labor per worker and a decrease in the number of workers employed. And these 2 effects, in turn, have opposite effects on the rate of profit. Section 3 presents a sketch of a pioneering theory of capitalism's boom-bust cycle, which follows directly from Marx's theory of the falling rate of profit. If capitalist crises are caused by a falling rate of profit, then a recovery from crises requires, above all else, a restoration of the rate of profit to previous higher levels. Furthermore, if the underlying cause of a falling rate of profit is an increase in the value composition of capital, that is, the ratio of constant capital to variable capital, then a restoration of the rate of profit requires a reduction in the value composition of capital, which is typically accomplished during capitalist depressions by the devaluation of capital that results from widespread bankruptcies of capitalist enterprises. Thus, Marx's theory not only predicts recurring capitalist crises, but also predicts that a precondition for recovery from crises is the devaluation of capital and widespread bankruptcies. Now, the sketch of a theory of capitalist cycles in this section is certainly a long way from a complete theory, but it was way ahead of all other economic theories at the time, which barely even recognized capitalism's tendency towards crisis. This is the whole crux, right? That the manifesto kind of points toward. And I think remains today a useful and unique framework within which to analyze capitalism's boom-bust cycles. Heinrich misses Marx's important theoretical achievements in these pages. I would assert that Heinrich does imply that. Heinrich has also argued that Engels changed a key phrase in section 3 of chapter 15 in such a way as to change Marx's meaning into its opposite. Marx stated that a closer analysis of the phenomenon of the overaccumulation of capital, i.e. of crises, belongs to the study of the apparent movement of capital where interest, capital, etc., and credit, etc., will be examined in more detail. This is an important statement by Marx that a more complete theory of crises requires more than the falling rate of profit. The role of credit and debt must also be incorporated. Engels changed Marx's phrase just quoted to the following, quote, its closer analysis follows later, unquote. Heinrich argues that the meaning of Marx's phrase is that a further analysis will come after this book. But the meaning of Engels' phrase is that a further analysis will come later in this book. However, the subjects that Marx explicitly referred to in his phrase, interest, capital, and credit, were in fact included later in Marx's Book 3 of Capital, Chapter 5 in Marx's manuscript, and Part 5 in Engels' Volume 3 to be discussed below. And of course, Engels knew this since he was editing Marx's manuscript and Chapter 5 was giving him fits. Therefore, Engels' phrase in this case is accurate, although it's unfortunate that Engels leaves out the specific topics of interest, capital, and credit that follow later in this book. This later discussion in Chapter 5 is still a long way from a complete theory of crises, but it is an extensive discussion of interest-bearing capital and interest and credit. While working on Chapter 3, Marx may not have intended to write so much about the credit system in this book, but he ended up writing quite a lot about the credit system. And that is what Engels was dealing with and referring to in this phrase. I'm going to stop here because we have still 2 more chapters to cover, which I will cover tomorrow. I've reached the end of my little time period here. And what we've been looking at is Fred Moseley's editing and Ben Fowlkes's translation of the Marx's economic manuscripts of 1864 to 1865, which is the equivalent of Volume 3. And the point of doing this is to look at Marx's original manuscripts as described by the big new collection, or newish collection MEGA, the MEGA, as opposed to the MECW, and that the texts by Marx that were not edited by Engels. So this is why there was this, so moving back and forth quickly, and I think it'll become clear if and when we get to the actual text. We're not even close to the actual text. We're in the introduction by Fred Moseley about some of the editing issues. And you will recall our conversation about some of these elements, not necessarily these particular elements, but that some of these differences are equally important in the understanding of the new edition of Volume 1, the new translation of Volume 1 in English. So with all of those little provisos, I will stop the live stream. Well, I'm trying.